Hello everyone, I'm Brian. Today I'm reacting to Vedantic Self and the Buddhist Non-Self, Swami Nanda. So there's going to be probably about 3 parts to this. 30 minutes at a time. It's about the most before I start losing memory on things for some odd reason. But this was probably given to me because I was looking into Buddhism. But I'm not, they're similar in some ways and different in others. So far, the Atman is one. I think the Buddhists believe that there's no Atman, if I remember correctly, but it's been a little bit. And the Vedantic is the fact that we are all Brahman Atman. So, anyways, let's go and give this a shot. CC's on.
Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityurma Amritam Gamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead me from the unreal to the real, lead me from darkness unto light, lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everybody. Namaste. Good morning. Today is the thrice blessed day. Technically not today, tomorrow. Buddha Purnima. It's the day when Bhagavan Buddha was born more than 2,500 years ago. It's the day when he attained enlightenment Bodhi and the final nirvana when he left his body. So the thrice blessed day. It is celebrated not only in India but all over the world, in the United Nations also. A gentleman who works in the United Nations said a couple of years back on this day, he said, oh, we are celebrating Vesak today. And being from India, I didn't quite get it. What was Vesak? Then I, of course, immediately thought about it. It's Vaishakhi. So that in the Southeastern Asian countries, Thailand and other places, it's called Vesak. And it's widely celebrated across the Southern Asia or Far East also. And now in the United Nations also. On this day, I usually give a talk about the life and teachings of the Buddha, but not today. What I'm going to do today is a little different. You have seen the subject, Vedantic Self and Buddhist Non-Self.
Real quick, 226. I need to... What was that name he gave? Hopefully it'll be on... Bhagavan Buddha. So I know Buddha is not... I originally thought Buddha was the name of the person, but it's not. It's oh my gosh! Oh my, wow! I can't remember. I remember this name now. I can't remember it. It's a Gautama Buddha. I'm assuming this is 2 different people. Not the I guess famous Buddha, I suppose, Gautaman. But this is Bhagavan Buddha. I'm assuming these are 2 different people. Let me know if I'm wrong, and maybe he'll explain it in the story. But I just want to get to that now, just in case he doesn't in the talk here. Right.
Or Buddhist no self. That's what we'll talk about. Why this subject? A couple of reasons. One reason is that it keeps coming up. Buddhism is so popular, and when we talk about Vedanta or any of the Hindu philosophies, one question that will inevitably come up if you think a little bit about it is you keep talking about the self, the Atman. Of course, self with a capital S, nevertheless, a self, an independent, unitary, eternal entity, exactly what the Buddhists deny. So there is no independent, eternal, separate self. It's exactly the opposite of, it's basically fundamentally what Buddhism is about, denying that. According to Buddhism, there is no such self. Not only that, it would be terrible if there were. It is the clinging to the concept of such a self. It's that self-clinging which is samsara. If you free yourself from that, then you will get liberation. It seems to be just the 180 degrees opposite to what Hinduism is saying. So Vedantic self, I keep talking about the Atman, and the Buddha and the Buddhists for 2,500 years, they keep talking about the Anatman, not self. So
that's actually interesting. I guess Vedanta is to grasp oneself as the ultimate being of one that's not affected by Maya or the transactional reality, but yet Buddha saying no, that's the reason why you're still here, is because you're trying to get to that one true self. It is still an attachment to something, and Buddha is to say to be non-attached to essentially everything, including the one self, I suppose, because then you'd be completely liberated when you have literally zero attachments. It's kind of, I guess it's kind of odd that, I don't know if it's odd or not, but just, I guess the Buddhist thinks that the one true self in Vedanta, if from my understanding, is that it's an attachment that you're getting to. Let me know if I'm right or wrong, or if you think it seems like that. You know, whatever you want to say.
I thought we should talk about it. I have spoken about it on different occasions, but a full talk. Also, a second reason for this would be, I actually did some work on this a couple of years back. I was part of a fellowship program at Harvard Divinity School. So during my time at Harvard University, I studied Buddhism quite a bit under two different very well-known professors. Of course, it was an academic study. I'm not a Buddhist, as you know. I'm a Vedantic monk. But I studied it under, I would say, world authorities. Professor Garfield, I studied Indo-Tibetan Madhyamaka Buddhism. And one of the things that I had to do was work on Chandrakirti's 7-point reasoning, the attack on the concept of the self, and what would Advaita Vedanta say to that. So I wrote this paper called Chandrakirti's Chariot, and I remember submitting it to Professor Garfield, who immediately rejected it. He said, "What do you think this is? A Vedanta society? He said, a Vedanta temple talk? It's a paper submitted at Harvard University. So you have to do these things." So I rewrote it again, and he promptly rejected it again. So the third time I submitted it, incorporating all his suggestions, which are all very good.
Man, writing a paper 3 times. Whew. I mean, I know. Generally speaking, I hate writing papers, honestly. But writing papers, I'm guessing that he made some changes to completely rewrite his perspective on a paper. Oh my God!
And then finally, he was happy with it. He said it's a very good defense of Advaita Vedanta. He didn't say very good. He said good defense of Advaita Vedanta against the Tibetan Buddhist attack on the concept of self. So because I put in that work, I thought let's just talk about it for some time. So let's start with the Buddha anyway. 2,500 years ago, we all know the story how Prince Siddhartha, in a small North Indian kingdom, which is now partly in North India, partly in Nepal, he was born there. He was a prince, and he was always deeply spiritual. It was predicted that he would either become a world conqueror or a world teacher, spiritual master, which he became both. Sort of. He is one of the greatest spiritual masters that the humanity has known, and has conquered the world. I mean, in that sense, the influence of Buddhism is across the whole world. Right here in the United States, for example. 2,500 years later, he continues to be highly revered, studied, taught, commented upon. His teachings have been elaborated endlessly over the last 25 centuries. We know very briefly that he saw these 4 sights as a young prince, saw an old person, a sick person, and a dead person. and then a monk, and then he saw
I'm sorry, I don't know.
a sick person and a dead person.
I remember my world religions teacher telling me about old person, sick person. I don't remember the dead person though. Because I remember the prince never saw anything bad. His father always gave him everything good. Fresh food every day. Like according to what my world religion teacher said, she said that fresh women every day. Never saw an old person in his life. Then he escaped one day, and I think he went with his guard. And I remember seeing the sick person. Yeah, people get sick. Eventually, that might happen to you. And it's like, what's the old person? It's like, yeah, everyone gets old. It's like, even me. It's like, yeah, even you. No one can escape these things.
And then a
Hopefully
monk
he explains it all.
And then he saw
like
that this suffering is all pervasive, and there's a quest to overcome suffering embodied by the monk. So he decides to become a monk in search of a solution to suffering. Remember, this is remarkable because he was not suffering. In fact, he was having a whale of a time. He was partying all day and night. So he was married to this beautiful princess. They had a little son, Rahula, and so on. But he noticed that nobody can escape suffering. Not his mother. He had lost his mother when he was young. Not his parents, the king and the queen. Not he himself, the prince. And so he sets out on a quest to overcome suffering, importantly, not just for himself, but for everybody, that there should be an end to suffering, because not just my suffering, but suffering per se. Then he goes and, importantly, he meets a number of spiritual masters, and he recounts this later on. They were some of the leading teachers of his time, and he learns from them, not satisfied with what they had taught him, not just the philosophy, but the practices. And then he goes on his own, and finally, under the Bodhi tree, he discovers the truth, the real nature of the self and the world, what is reality, and that reality sets him free. So that freedom is called nirvana. Bodhi, wisdom, enlightenment, sets him free. And then he, for the next 40 years, this is the first 40 years of his life, next 40 years he roams the length and breadth of North India. And he organizes this huge monastic order. It was initially a very part of the general society. It was not distinct from Hinduism in any way in those days. And it was a group of dedicated band of practitioners, were all monks. Later on, nuns, bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, and lay people. And finally, it was codified into this religion on its own, the Buddha Dharma. And from the very beginning, it spread across India and then beyond the frontiers of India. Swami Vivekananda says about the tolerance, the acceptance of the Hindus, that here is a teacher, a prominent teacher, who disavows, who does not accept the authority of your texts, the Vedas, and criticizes the orthodox religion of the time to your face. And he was not only tolerated, he was honored, he was accepted. Huge numbers of people converted into Buddhism, became Buddhists. I don't know if at any time the majority of Indians were Buddhists, but certainly a very big minority, very large numbers of people. They were large monasteries. They were the first universities of the world, huge universities which came up, and that will play some role in our talk today. And then Buddhism spread across India and beyond India to Sri Lanka. The Emperor Ashoka sent his own son and daughter as emissaries of Buddhism to Southeast Asia, to what is now Thailand and Burma, and then later on across the mountains to Tibet. This is, of course, hundreds of years later. To Tibet, to China, Korea, Japan, up to the Middle East also. What is now Afghanistan, and in the Middle East there are some records of Buddhist monks going as far as that. So, and today it's all over the world. It's here in the United States, very prominent. The Dalai Lama is one of the most well-known figures in the world today. All right. Now, what happened was, as the Buddhists, Buddha and the Buddhists after him, advocated the doctrine of not self or no self, anatma. I'll use the term no self. No self against the Hindu teaching of a self. The Hindus naturally responded. The various schools of Hinduism, philosophical schools, like the Nyaya, the Vaisheshika, the Sankhya, and the Purva Mimamsa, these four were prominent in responding to the attacks from Buddhist schools. Remember, it's not that the Buddhists were only debating with the Hindus. The multiple Buddhist schools came up which were engaged with each other in debate. So I remember one class in Professor Garfield's class where one of the Buddhist philosophers is making some attacks on this person, on this school, that school. I don't know what those English terms mean. So I sort of approximate translations in Sanskrit. I thought this was this particular Hindu school, that particular Hindu school, and Professor Garfield smiled and said, none of them are Hindu schools, they are all Buddhist schools. So he's attacking other Buddhists.
That's kind of weird and interesting at the same time, considering that why are there different teachings in Buddhist schools? I figured it'd be all kind of come from the same teachings. Is there, I'm guessing in modern day, different kinds of Advaita Vedanta schools that are also debating each other? Or is there, I guess it's kind of like, well, in religion there's Christianity or whatever it is, and then there's a whole bunch of subgenres, sub-religions of that. But I assume they mostly followed it, well, they kind of follow the same book to a degree, but different interpretations. Is that the same thing going on with the Buddhist schools here? It's kind of figured that at least maybe earlier on in the Buddhist history, that because the teachings were so fresh and so, well, I won't say new, but so new, that there should be not too many interpretations of it, considering that it's all kind of relatively new, all the same meaning. But are there also, in say modern day now, Advaita Vedanta, different, I guess, schoolings of that, where you have one person that's Advaita Vedanta and another person say with the same learn, or would they have different points of views? If there is, I'm kind of curious as to what those different points of views is, because it can't be the overall message, which would be, you know, Atman, you being the one true self. I'm wondering, perhaps maybe it's the path is the difference, where each Advaita Vedanta's person would be like how they approach the Atman, how to get there, by either worshipping gods or worshipping whatever it may be, or not worshipping at all, but just to, like, was it the different yogas, karma, bhakti, jnana, and raja yogas?
So there was an enormous amount of debate on various issues. One of those issues was the existence of a self, of an Atman. And allied to this was the issue, actually a secondary issue of God. Because the Nyaya school, for example, would say, Atma, there is an eternal self. We are an immortal soul, an eternal self. And this eternal self comes in two varieties, two flavors. One is sentient beings like us, each of us individually. We are eternal selves, Atma. And there is one special kind of Atma of which there is only one, and that's God. So God and immortal souls, they are all Atmas. One is Atma, one is Paramatma, Jivatma, Paramatma, this individual sentient being and the Supreme Lord. So if you could dismiss the individual, eternal individual being, self, you could dismiss the God also. That would be another avenue of attack. So these were two areas of attack, of debate between the Buddhists and the Hindu schools, and among each other also, over a period of 1,000 years. There was a course by Professor Patil at Harvard, which I really liked it. Intensive course on classical Indian Buddhism. 1,000 years of Buddhist philosophy in Sanskrit, translated into incomprehensible English, and endless readings, handouts, most of which made very little sense if you read it in English. But still, very interesting. This was one of the golden periods of development of Indian philosophy. The other one, I would say, was later in the medieval period, when Buddhism had all but disappeared from India. Then the real debate was between the non-dualists, the Advaitins, and the other schools, the dualist Dvaitins, the Vishishta Dvaitins, qualified monists, and various other schools of Vedanta and Nyaya attacking non-dualism. And so there was another burst of development in Indian philosophy. So these two eras.
That's so kind of weird, though. How did Buddhists become so popular and so strong, and all of a sudden, just nearly died out? Like, I've heard some parts of the stories where, like, especially in the comments, I've heard, like, Buddhists were kind of mean or were really ruthless with their takeover over Advaita Vedanta, and but I certainly hope it wasn't like beating up people or anything. Just maybe they produced good arguments, and then all of a sudden it got nearly wiped out because I'm assuming that 1,000-year debate, which I want to hear. I wish there was a record of it, and then just someone reading the transcript or reading the whatever was recorded to see what the debates and counter arguments were for, because that's how you really that's how you get the ideas challenged and see what the answers to those questions are. And just generally speaking, that's, for me, answering my questions or getting questions answered helps me understand things a lot better, because obviously questions are for me anyway, questions are what fills in the hole, if you could say, of the understanding of whatever it may be. But yeah, good. I mean, it nearly wiped them out after the 1,000-year debate, and all of a sudden, I didn't hear about the second one, where maybe I have kind of a hint of Advaita Vedanta versus other schools.
But primarily, the 1,000 years which followed the Buddha, more than 1,000 years actually, up to the end of the first millennium. What would the Buddha himself thought about it? I think he wouldn't have had a very high opinion of all of this. There is, for example, in Buddha's original dialogues, there is this, when he sees this subtle debates going on. He said, "O monks, when your house is on fire, would you debate the nature of fire, or would you put it out?
I mean,
when you are shot with an arrow, would you give discourses on arrows, or help the try to take the arrow out and save yourself? Such is the nature of suffering. Instead of discoursing on the nature of suffering, on subtle discussions on that, one would try to overcome suffering." And so when the Buddha was asked questions like this, does the self exist or does it not? Will the Buddha be there after death, after the death of the body? And so on. Number of questions. In fact, 14 great silences of the Buddha are there. Why did the Buddha keep silent on these subjects? If you ask the Buddha, today's question, self or no self? Is there a self? The Buddha's answer actually was, did I say there was? So the monk, the bhikkhu, jumps to the other conclusion. Oh, so there is no self. Did I say there was not? Then he's puzzled. What do you mean? There either is or there is not. And then the Buddha says, and so other teachers teach this. Some say there is a self, some say there is nothing. And they were nihilists or materialists who said there was no permanent self at all, this matter. So what are you teaching?
I remember someone telling the same story where someone who believes in the self, he tells them, it's like, oh, there's no self. And then the one person says, oh, I believe there's no self, but I don't know which one's true. It's like, well, there is a self. I forget what was I remember the story, but I can't remember what was the point of the story. I think it's to keep people in question, I think, to keep thinking and seeking. And I guess in the fire story, it's kind of like, what's the point in debating this stuff when the ultimate outcome is just to find your way to exit samsara or to end suffering? I'm thinking that's what he meant.
He says, I teach that there is suffering, and there is a reason for suffering, cause, and there is an end to suffering, and there is a way out of suffering, the Four Noble Truths. Very practical. A practical system of ethics and meditation designed to take you directly to enlightenment and freedom. So, dukkha, suffering, first noble truth. Sarvam dukkham, all is suffering. Somebody told me, don't translate it as suffering, because a lot of people are actually not suffering. But just about everybody is dissatisfied.
Yeah, that's
so translate it as dissatisfaction with state of things. And it can intensify into pain and suffering. Then the second one is, there is a cause of this. It's not just random. There's a cause of suffering, and that is desire, trishna, thirst. The thirst for making this seeming individual self fully satisfied with this world, and not being happy if I'm not fully satisfied all the time. Like thinking everybody should be endlessly nice to me all the time. It sounds ridiculous if I say that, but my behavior seems to show that I implicitly believe that. Somebody is rude to me and I become unhappy for the rest of the day. Why? Because I believe somewhere everybody all the time should be consistently, endlessly nice to me. No. So this thirst that everything should be perfect for me all the time, otherwise I'm going to be dissatisfied. Third, is there an end to this? Yes. Whatever has a cause can be started and stopped. You remove the cause, it will stop. So the end is called nirvana, freedom. The Indologist Heinrich Zimmer, he says that the philosophies of India are actually optimistic. They sound pessimistic because they talk about suffering, but they're optimistic because they all offer an end to suffering. And that there is, and that end is in our own hands. It's a spiritual end in which we can generate ourselves. So nirvana, it's an old and very honored term in India. There are many such words: nirvana, moksha, kaivalya, apavarga. They all mean the same thing. Different philosophies had these terms. So nirvana is possible. And then, what is the method? The eightfold way, Ashtanga Marga. I'm not going to go into that. Eightfold way. That's the method. One medieval philosopher, Madhavacharya, he wrote this book, Sarva Darshana Sangraha, a collection of different philosophies. So towards the end, he says, these philosophers are like chikitsakanam, just like doctors. What do? They see the symptom, pain, suffering. Then they identify the cause. What's the disease? Desire, trishna. Then they identify that whether it's curable or incurable, and they come to the conclusion it's curable. There is nirvana, moksha. You can attain peace and fulfillment. You can go beyond suffering. And then, is there a treatment? Yes, there is a treatment. That is the marga, the way. So Buddha is like that. The symptom, the cause, the cure, and the treatment. So that was the Buddha and the Buddhist Sangha which came up. About 500 years after the Buddha, the greatest of the Buddhist philosophers, I would say. There are many, many great philosophers. Nagarjuna, Dharmakirti, Chandrakirti, Dingnaga. Extraordinary people whose value we are only now beginning to, sort of excavate, actually. You have to do a little bit of philosophical, like archaeological digging, philosophical digging to see how remarkable they were. Just about every philosophical point of view under the sun today had already been discussed threadbare in ancient India more than 1,000, 1,500 years ago.
I don't know why I thought of this. It's ridiculous. But I could only imagine these people in modern times going on Twitter or Reddit or whatever place where they have debates, and then you have this chronological order of arguments. I think that's ridiculous, but also amazing, because then at least we'd have a transcript of it and we can all read it and see what the arguments are. It's like stupid and amazing at the same time, because you imagine these wise people typing on their computers on Reddit or Twitter, making an argument for their stuff. It looks ridiculous, but at the same time, though, at least we have the transcripts and the arguments, so we can us ourselves can read them and judge for ourselves or understand for ourselves. I don't know why I thought of it at that time, but he said threadbare. It made me think of threads on like discussion forums.
But among them shines undisputed brightness is Nagarjuna, who lived in the south of India, in what is now Andhra. And he is famous for his book, the Moola Madhyamaka Karika. Moola Madhyamaka Karika. So the kind of Buddhism which traces itself back to Nagarjuna. He was just elaborating the teachings of the Buddha. So it is called Madhyamaka Buddhism. Madhyama literally means the middle path. So the middle path. Here, middle path philosophically. Between the two extremes of eternalism, Hindus, and nihilism, that nothing exists, like the materialists. There's no truth at all. There's nothing. That's materialism. He says, no, there is. There is a spiritual truth which will set you free. But it's not what the other schools, the orthodox schools of Hinduism are saying, that there is one separate, limited self. There's a body, there's a mind, and there is an Atma. Not like that. So the middle path, Madhyamaka, middle path philosophically. Nagarjuna took Buddha's silence philosophically. Why did Buddha keep quiet? One reason was practical. Be spiritual, get enlightenment. But also, the silence was the correct answer to these questions.
Why was it the correct answer to those questions? Because these are questions... I'm going to try to make a guess here. These are questions that are very difficult and no proof to have, maybe? Because that's my assumptions. It's because they need proof in seeming to be in a physical way. Because I think Buddhist I don't know why I'd struggle with that. Because I believe they're kind of materialistic, so it has to be in the material realm, the transactional realm. And to say there's nothing makes sense in terms of the fact that, look at the absolute reality, that does not exist for them. There's only the Maya or the transactional realm. I don't know if they have the subjective. I'm sure they do. I think these two realms are pretty universal in terms of either certain philosophies or just people's understanding. You have subjective reality, which is something that I only personally experience, which is not part of the objective reality. Objective reality being that what everyone can see for the most part.
Because any answer you express in language is actually logical. If you want a very precise logical answer, it'll be wrong.
Yeah.
Whatever you say. If you say there is no Atma, wrong. If you say there is the self, wrong. Yeah. Why is that so? How can you logically formulate that truth? So that was Nagarjuna's effort, what he tried to do. He also, if you see the book Mula Madhyamaka Karika, it's fascinating. Philosophers, I think, especially nowadays, and so many philosophers are fascinated with it. It's entirely negative. It demolishes everything. He says, Shunyata sarva drishtinam, the emptiness of all philosophies. Not only philosophies, whatever we think and do in daily life, all of it is full of contradictions. One reason might be because of all these subtle discussions. He wanted to show that you will not come at a formulated philosophy, linguistically formulated philosophy, which will adequately grasp the truth. You can't do it. Even simple things cannot be grasped by logic. So, I think 23 chapters. He demolishes concept of a self, Atma. He demolishes the concept of Dharma. He demolishes the concept of Tathagata, Buddha. He's Buddhist. Demolishes the concept of the Four Noble Truths. Demolishes the concept of Nirvana, freedom. But what he's doing is not that they are wrong. He's saying the way you're trying to express them and limit them, this is what the Buddha taught. That doesn't work. Why it doesn't work, he will show. Even common things like walking. Just walking, the ordinary walking that we do. He says even that's full of contradiction. I'll give you a sample of Nagarjuna today, quickly. So he says, we say the walker is walking. Okay. And his question is, who is walking? Well, the walker is walking. But the walker is defined as somebody who's walking, right? Who already has the property of walking. As the action of walking is inherent in the walker. See, he's using language which was used by the Nyayas. So Nyaya school, you need to know a little bit of Nyaya philosophy. They were realists. They took the common sense experience of the world as real and described it with their philosophy.
If I remember that correctly, are they the one that only believes in personal experience and not anything written or anything said? You yourself must experience it for you to believe it. Anything that anyone says or anything that's been written, you don't believe that because it's not something that you personally experienced. If I remember correctly, let me know.
So, action. In hers, action is there in the agent. You are walking, so there is an action called walking. It's really there. And where is it? It's in you. Everything has to be clear. There is a person who's walking. Walking is an action. Where is the action? It can't be in the road. It must be in you. So you are the walker and walking is in you. Nagarjuna asks, so you are the walker? Yes. How do you define as the walker? The one who has the property of walking. Now you say, who is walking? The walker is walking. So there is two walkings. One, the walker has the property of walking in you, and then the walker is walking. So there are two walkings. Then Dvirgamanam Syat. Did he walk twice? So no. He walked only once. So it is the person who was not walking, that person walks. So the not walker walks. Do you see the contradiction in that?
It's walking and not walking are a matter of. I don't know if I'm going to be right. I'm just going to say what I thought. It's like it's a matter of action. You cannot do both actions at the same time. At any given point, you're only doing one action, either not walking or walking, but not both at the same time. So I don't see that as a contradiction. You're either not walking or you're walking. You're not both. Unless one of your legs is not walking and the other one is walking, then that's a different story. But yeah, I don't. Let me know. Do you understand that contradiction? I didn't see it as a contradiction. You can only do one of the two. You're not both.
He said, no. I mean, it's just a person. There's no such thing as walking in him. So where is the walking? It's in the road. Is the road walking? So he goes. You see, the whole book is like that. So if you ask him, he developed this what is called Chatushkoti, the 4 options or the 4 alternatives. A very powerful logical tool. It's about 2,000 years ago, where any question you throw at him, any philosophy, he tears it to pieces based on these 4 alternatives. What are the 4 alternatives? Suppose you say something like, there is God. He will show that it is wrong that there is God. Oh, so you are trying to show you are a Buddhist, you don't believe in God, there is no God. He says it is wrong to say that there is no God. Oh, so then God both is and is not. That's a contradictory statement. How can God both be and not be? So it is wrong to say that God is and is not.
That's the same thing with the freaking cat in the box that you hear. I can't remember what's like someone's cat. The thing is though is that it cannot be both at the same time. Absolutely true. And I never understood that. Because you know, he's like, there's a cat in the box. Is it dead or alive? It's like, well, I don't know. I have to look to find out. You know, it could be dead. It could be alive. It's not both. It's one. It's not the other. And I probably should look up that riddle a little bit more and get an understanding of it. I may have once, but it's still quite stuck to me. But anyways, I definitely need to look at that a little bit deeper and have a better understanding of it. I just kind of looked at it once, then it just was like, what? And this is basically the same thing right here. I can't remember what the cat was called, the Schomer's cat or something like that. But yeah, you don't know. You're making an assumption on something that you don't know anything about. There might not even be a cat in the box, you know? It's like, he's like, no, there's a cat in the box. Like, how do you know? Did you look? Oh, if you look, then is it alive or dead? No, it's like, I looked like 5 days ago. It's like, well, then you don't know if it's still there or not.
So, is it that God neither is nor is not? And he said, no, that is wrong. It's not that God neither is nor is not. So these are the 4 alternatives. You say there is a self. He says, no, I will show that there cannot be an Atman, as you will see how he will show. There can't be a self. So there is no self, no Atma. No, that's also wrong. It's not that there is no Atma. So there both is a self and not there is no self. So that's obviously contradictory. So it's not that there is a self and there is no self. So the opposite of that, you deny that. There is neither a self nor not a self. He says neither that also. Chatushkoti vinirmukta tattvam. The reality is beyond the 4 alternatives. Beyond the 4 alternatives is reality. That's what he calls shunyam, emptiness. Emptiness is, if you examine any view, any philosophical view which is positively stated, he says I can demonstrate logically that it falls apart, and that's the emptiness of that view. Somebody says, wait a minute, your philosophy, Mr. Nagarjuna, Professor Nagarjuna, let's say, Professor Nagarjuna, your philosophy, your view, so that according to you, that also should be empty. Nagarjuna says, but I don't have a view. Shunyata sarvadrishtinam, emptiness of all views. If I had a view, you could cut it down, but since I have no view, you can't cut it down. So this is a kind of debate in ancient India.
So So to hold a view would be to cut it down. To hold no views would be there'd be nothing to cut down. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, you know, but do we... I mean, that's kind of like what I guess a lot of Advaita Vedanta is talking about, is to some degree have no view, to have no biases, basically. I'm sure this probably goes a little bit deeper than just having no points of view or no biases. This is literally just no points of view whatsoever. And then I know Sadhguru talks about going into something without your biases, but that's still, there is still an idea there, though.
It was called Vitanda. To understand this, there were three kinds of debates which were popular. Vada, Jalpa, Vitanda. Vada was a debate between, say, people who were trying to find the truth, inquiry. You could shift your positions and learn and change your ideas and all of that. Then that's the best kind of debate. And ideally, debates were supposed to be like that. But practically, they were not. There was a second kind of debate was Jalpa, where you had your position and your opponent has their position, and then you debate. You try to establish your position and cut down the opponent's position. The opponent tries to establish their position and cut down your position. Swapaksha sthapanam, parapaksha dushanam. That is and there are so many techniques and rules. These ancient debates were like gladiatorial combats, intellectual. So they were very sophisticated system of debate, and so it was a wonderful thing. It prevented a lot of crudeness and violence in ancient India. So only experts engaged in this, and it would be conducted at a very high level of sophistication. Sometimes they actually met and discussed these things. Sometimes it was in writing. The third kind of debate which Nagarjuna is doing is called Vitanda. Vitanda means, I have no position. I'll just cut down whatever you say. Now, that sounds very rude, but actually that's a very sophisticated form of philosophy. That any kind of philosophical position is bound to be false. You state it, I'll show you that it is false. I'm not saying that there's no truth, but the truth lies beyond your philosophical positions. So Nagarjuna is a classical case of a Vitanda type of debate. Another one, well...
That sounds so much like a movie that I kind of like. I think it's called Thank You for Smoking, and the whole point of this guy is to not prove a point, but to make you look like a fool in your debate. One person is trying to prove something to disprove, because this guy, the main character, works for or is hired by a tobacco company. And he's not there to prove anything about tobaccos, but essentially he's hired to disprove or to show that the opponent's a fool. And it almost sounds like that. And I really did like that movie. I gotta watch it again, because and that's the thing that he taught, or that's what he said. It's like, I'm not here to prove my points better, because it's not. But it's just to make my opponent look like a fool, which makes the crowd like me more, in a sense. And the reason why I'm saying that is because it sounds like even though he's not proving a point, but he's making his opponent not necessarily look like a fool, but just to contradict the opponent. Then all of a sudden he's like, I don't believe this person that's trying to make a point, and this other guy's just cutting it down.
Known as Sri Harsha, who was interestingly an Advaitin, non-dualist, and he follows the same technique. Whatever position you have, I'll show you it's wrong, and by that, what I'm trying to teach, non-dual Vedanta, will stand automatically established. I don't have to argue to establish it. Sri Harsha is one of the very few classical Indian Hindu philosophers who says Nagarjuna is right. He says at the very beginning, with the Madhyamakas, that means Nagarjuna's followers, we have no quarrel. He says at the beginning of his text. His text is Khandana Khanda Khadya, the cookies of refutation. Khanda Khadya means sweets or cookies. So the book is called the delicious of refutation, of cutting down. He delights in cutting down other people's views. So Nagarjuna wrote this book, 23 chapters, all entirely negative. And whatever philosophy you could have, including, very fairly, just about all Buddhist approaches, he cuts it down. Now he had commentators, those who developed his philosophy further, not too much. the major person whom we are interested in today is Chandrakirti. Chandrakirti, one of the greatest Buddhist philosophers today.
We'll get with that on the next video. So I'll end the video, me talking now. So, I don't know if you want to watch that movie. I think it's called Thank You for Smoking. And again, I'm not saying like everything about in that movie maybe talks in a philosophical type of way, but it was just very interesting. I really liked the movie again because of how he approached things. Him just out there to not prove his point, not to say that smoking is great, but just to make the other person look like a bumbling fool, and in a sense he wins the argument, which is again and some idea is similar to that argument where he's saying, no, I don't have a point of view, I'm just disproving yours. And I'm wondering if that movie had inspired by that philosophy. I definitely got to look it up now. But yes, anyways, that's the end of part 1. It's more than likely to be 3 parts, this one being 1. If you like my content, please consider subscribing, thumbs up, thumbs down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next vid.